The morning felt calm when he stepped out of his car. It's the kind of quiet that makes you breathe a little slower and pay closer attention to the world around you. He had driven to the block early on purpose. The sun was still low and the shadows were long across the old pavement. It was a street he had visited only once before, and even then it was from the outside. Today, he wanted to walk through every corner, check every building, look at the small details most people ignored. That was how he liked to work. He preferred to see things himself, instead of relying only on papers and reports. He closed the car door gently, trying not to disturb anyone. The houses were lined up neatly, even though many of them needed repairs. Some had peeling paint. Some had cracked sidewalks. A few had old fences leaning slightly to the side. But there was something peaceful about the place, too. Trees stood tall along the street, leaves moving softly in the morning air. Birds made small sounds from the branches. A few windows had curtains that hadn't been fully pulled back. Suggesting people weren't awake yet, he took out his notebook and pen. He always carried them, even though he had a phone with all kinds of modern tools. There was something about writing things down by hand that made him feel connected to the place he was studying. As he walked toward the first building on the corner, he began taking note scracks on the steps. Condition of the roof, the color of the walls, how much sunlight the front yard received. Little details mattered to him. They helped him understand what needed fixing, what could be improved, and what should remain just as it was. He took a few photos with his phone. Nothing unusual, just regular pictures for documentation. A window, a wall, a mailbox, a few patches where grass refused to grow. He had done this hundreds of times on different properties all over the city. It was part of his job, and it usually went smoothly. People rarely bothered him. Even when they did, a simple explanation was enough. Most folks appreciated someone improving their area. But today, something felt different. He noticed a man standing on a porch across the street, staring at him. At first, he didn't think much of it. It was normal for people to watch someone unfamiliar walking around. It was a residential block after all. But the man kept looking, even when he turned away and walked farther down the sidewalk. A few seconds later, he noticed another person, this time a woman peeking through her window blinds. As soon as she saw him glance her way, the blinds snapped shut. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. People were curious. That was natural. Maybe they assumed he was a delivery person, or someone looking for an address. Maybe they were just cautious. Still, the way they stared had a certain heaviness to it, as if they were trying to judge who he was without knowing anything about him. He brushed the thought, sighed, and continued his work. He walked along the block, writing down notes. The cool air felt refreshing. A car drove by slowly, the driver giving him a long look before continuing down the road. He took another picture of a wall that had water damage. He stepped over a small broken step. He made a voice memo on his phone about repairing the back alley drainage. But the feeling of being watched continued. By the time he reached the halfway point of the street, he heard a voice from behind him. "Hey, what are you doing here?" It wasn't angry, but it wasn't friendly either. More like someone who felt entitled to demand answers. He turned around. A woman stood with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She looked at him like he had interrupted her morning on purpose. He kept his tone polite. "Just taking some notes," he said. "I'm checking the condition of the buildings on this block." She asked instantly. No greeting, no small talk. He didn't want to explain too much. Not because it was secret, but because he liked keeping things simple until he had all the details sorted. "Property evaluation," he replied. "Nothing harmful." The woman didn't look convinced. She glanced back at the house behind her, then back at him, like she was unsure whether she should believe him or call someone. Before he could say anything else, she turned around and walked back inside. He sighed quietly and returned to his notes. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't disturbing anyone. He wasn't touching anyone's property. But it was clear the neighbors didn't recognize him. And more importantly, they didn't seem interested in asking questions politely. They were judging him from a distance. Deciding who they thought he was based on nothing more than his presence, he hoped the tension would fade. But it didn't. As he moved toward the last building on the block, He heard something that made him stop. A siren faint at first, but getting louder. He turned his head. 2 police cars were approaching from the corner. For a moment, he wondered if there was an emergency happening nearby, maybe an accident or a medical call. But the cars slowed down as they reached him. One parked in front of him, the other behind, blocking the street like they were responding to something important. He stood still. Calmly holding his notebook, one of the officers stepped out. "Sir," the officer said, "we got a call about a suspicious person walking around the neighborhood." He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. Suspicious him? For carrying a notebook and camera in broad daylight? He kept a polite tone. "I'm not doing anything unusual," he said. "I'm just checking the condition of the buildings." The officer nodded slowly, not hostile but cautious. "We still need to check your ID. It's just procedure." He understood. They had to follow what they were told. He reached into his pocket, moved slowly to avoid any misunderstanding, and handed over his identification. The officer examined it carefully, then looked at him again. "Are you working for someone on this block?" the officer asked. "Yes," he replied, but he didn't give details yet. It wasn't time, and he wanted to see how the situation unfolded before revealing everything. The second officer walked around, observing the surroundings. A few neighbors stepped outside or pressed closer to their windows, eager to watch what was happening. It wasn't simple curiosity. It was the kind of attention people gave when they felt justified in their assumptions. One neighbor across the street pointed in his direction and said something to another person beside him. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The expressions were clear. They believed they had done the right thing by calling the police. The officer holding his ID looked at him again. "Someone said you were taking pictures of houses," he said. "I was," he replied calmly. "For documentation, they said you were acting strange." He gave a small shrug. "I'm just doing my work." The officers didn't seem hostile. In fact, they appeared a little embarrassed. They weren't dealing with a threat. They were dealing with a misunderstanding created by bored neighbors with too much time and too little patience. But the neighbors didn't know that. A man on a porch raised his voice, trying to be heard from across the street. "Ask him what he's really doing here." The officers ignored him. The officer with his ID sighed as if he already sensed this situation wasn't what the neighbors thought. "Look, sir," he said in a low voice, "we just need to verify a couple of things." "This won't take long," he nodded. "No problem. I understand." He stood quietly while the officers made a call to confirm his identification. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel scared. He felt disappointed not in the police, but in the people who had assumed the worst without even speaking to him first, as the officers waited for confirmation. A small group of neighbors formed across the street. They weren't whispering quietly. They were talking loudly on purpose. A few crossed their arms. Some shook their heads. One person even took out a phone to record the scene as if he were some kind of troublemaker. He noticed their stares, the kind that make a person feel judged before they even say a word. He didn't respond. He didn't approach them. He didn't defend himself. He simply stayed where he was and waited. The senior officer returned. "Everything checks out," he said. "But before we leave, is there anyone we can contact about the property? You said you're working on the block?" He smiled slightly. "Yes," he said. "I can give you the details. Or my assistant can bring the documents if that's easier." The officer nodded. "That would help, just so we can close this out cleanly." "If you don't mind." "No problem," he replied. "I'll call her now." He took out his phone and made a quick call. His assistant answered right away, and he explained what had happened. She assured him she would bring the entire property portfolio and arrive soon. While he waited, he noticed the neighbors whispering again. Their expressions were growing more intense, like they were expecting him to suddenly do something that proved their suspicions right. But he remained calm. He knew the truth, and soon they would too. He sat on the small bench under a tree while the officers waited nearby. The morning sun filtered through the branches, casting little patterns of light on the ground. He listened to the soft sound of birds again. It was peaceful, even with all the tension in the air. He looked around at the houses, at the people who lived in them, at the street he had come to evaluate. He wondered how different this moment would be if they had simply walked up to him earlier and asked what he was doing instead of jumping to conclusions. He didn't hold anger toward them. People often reacted out of fear, habit, or misunderstanding, but that didn't make their actions fair. And it didn't change the fact that they had judged him harshly without giving him a chance to speak. After a few quiet minutes, he saw a car turn onto the street. His assistant waved at him through the window. As she parked, the neighbors leaned forward, curious. The officer stood up straighter. She stepped out holding a neatly organized folder, filled with documents, purchase contracts, maps, and ownership records for the entire way block. He knew what was coming next, and he knew the neighbors had no idea how wrong they were. The moment his assistant stepped out of the car with the thick folder in her hands, the whole street seemed to tense up even more. It was strange, almost like the air had shifted. The neighbors who had been whispering earlier became completely silent, as if they were preparing themselves for some dramatic moment. A few of them even leaned forward on their porches, holding their breath like they were watching a scene unfold in a movie. But he didn't pay much attention to their reactions. He simply stood up from the bench and walked toward his assistant with calm steps. She greeted the officers politely, holding out the folder. The officers took it and started flipping through the documents. They moved to the side, checking each paper carefully. Meanwhile, the neighbors couldn't help themselves. Some walked a little closer, pretending they were just stretching their legs. Even though it was obvious they just wanted to hear what the police were saying, he could feel the nervous energy around them, but he kept his expression relaxed. He knew everything would be clear when the officers reached the ownership pages. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet the neighbors acted as if he had snuck into the neighborhood with bad intentions. It was amazing how quickly people jumped to conclusions without asking a single question. He thought about how simple it would have been for someone to just ask, "Hey, do you need help?" But instead, the first reaction had been to call the police. He didn't let the frustration show. Years of experience had taught him patience. People rarely saw past their assumptions, and he had learned that the best way to handle those moments was with quiet confidence. The senior officer walked back toward him with the folder still open. His expression had softened completely. "Sir," he said in a more respectful tone, "these documents clear everything up. Thank you for cooperating." "No problem," he replied calmly. "I appreciate you handling everything professionally." The officer nodded. "We just needed to make sure you were authorized to be here. Someone reported unusual activity and, well, we have to respond." He gave a small, apologetic smile, like he felt awkward about the whole thing. "It's pretty clear now that you weren't doing anything wrong." He accepted the apology with a simple nod. He didn't want to make the situation heavier than it already was. "I understand," he said. "You're just doing your job." Before the officer could continue, a voice cut in from across the street. "Wait, what did the papers say?" It was the same neighbor who had been watching him earlier, the one who had raised his voice when the police arrived. The man walked closer now, his tone more defensive than curious. The officer glanced at him, then looked back at the owner, as if waiting to see if he wanted to explain. He chose to stay quiet. It wasn't time for explanations yet. The neighbor stepped closer. "I'm just asking because, well, we saw you taking pictures. You were walking up and down the block. That's not normal. Anyone would think it's suspicious." He didn't respond. "Not yet," another neighbor chimed in from her porch. "We were only trying to protect the community," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "We didn't know who you were." His assistant stood beside him, holding onto the folder, quietly observing. She didn't say anything either. She knew him well enough to wait until he spoke. The senior officer finally answered the neighbors calmly. "Everything is fine," he said. "He isn't doing anything wrong. He's here on official business." "Official business?" the neighbor repeated, frowning. "What kind of business?" The officer hesitated for a second. He didn't want to reveal something that wasn't his to reveal, so he looked at the owner once again. This time, decided to speak. "I'm evaluating the block," he said in a steady voice. "For who?" another neighbor asked sharply. For the people who own it, he replied. A few neighbors whispered again, confused. They clearly didn't understand. One person even whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe he's with some company trying to buy the place. He kept his calm expression. The officer continued scanning the remaining pages. But the tension among the neighbors only grew. They wanted answers, and they wanted them immediately. A woman stepped forward from the sidewalk, clutching her sweater. Look, you have to understand, she said. We get all kinds of people walking around here. We're not trying to be rude. We just want to feel safe. He finally turned to her, his tone gentle but grounded. I understand, he said, but I wasn't doing anything unsafe. I was just working. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Well, maybe, but you can't blame us for. His assistant stepped closer, quietly clearing her throat as she pointed at a page in the folder the officer was holding. They might want to look at that part, she said softly. The officer glanced down. His eyebrows rose just a bit. Then he handed the page to his partner beside him. They exchanged looks, the kind that said, well, this explains everything. The senior officer closed the folder carefully and handed it back. He straightened his posture before addressing the neighbors again. There's nothing suspicious going on, he said firmly. He's not just working here. He has full rights to walk the block. What kind of rights? Someone asked. The officer answered in a simple tone. Ownership rights. The words dropped into the air like a stone sinking into water. Everything went still. One neighbor blinked several times, unsure if he heard correctly. Another neighbor's mouth fell slightly open. A couple whispering near a fence immediately stopped talking. Ownership. Someone finally repeated, sounding stunned. The officer nodded. Yes, he owns the properties on this block. The silence after that was almost strange. Even the birds in the trees seemed to quiet down, as if they were waiting to see what would happen next. The man who had called out earlier looked completely thrown off. He stepped back, his voice suddenly uncertain. You own the block. This block. He simply nodded once. Yes. The woman who had rushed inside earlier came back out, holding a cup of tea she had forgotten she was making. Her hands froze midair. She didn't blink for a full second. Then she slowly lowered the cup but didn't say anything. The officer tried to ease the tension. There's no issue here, he said calmly. Everything is in order. If there's nothing else, we're going to clear the call. But the neighbors didn't walk away. Not yet. They were too shocked, too embarrassed, too confused by how wrong they had been. One neighbor finally spoke up, her voice shaky. We didn't know. It's fine, he said gently, though inside he wasn't sure if it was fine. The way they had treated him wasn't just about not knowing. It was about judging from a distance. A taller man, one who had been staring the longest, took a slow step forward. He scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. So, you're, the owner? Yes, he replied simply. The man swallowed hard. Of every house. Most of them, he said. A few more are under paperwork. The neighbors exchanged looks, big, wide, stunned looks. Someone else cleared their throat. If we had known, we wouldn't have called the police. He didn't say anything right away. He wanted them to sit with that feeling, not out of spite, but because sometimes people needed to feel the weight of their own assumptions. His assistant stood silently beside him, as calm as he was. She knew that whenever things got tense like this, he rarely raised his voice or acted superior. He just stayed steady, and that quiet steadiness often made. People reflect on their own actions more deeply than anger ever could. The officer gave him a final polite nod. Everything is good here, he said. If you need anything else, feel free to call. Then he added softly, and thank you for being patient. Of course, he replied. The officers walked back to their cars. The engines started, and soon the cars rolled away from the block, leaving the neighbors face to face with the man they had misjudged so quickly. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, one woman broke the silence. She tucked her hair behind her ear, nervous. We didn't mean to treat you badly, she said quietly. We didn't know who you were. I understand, he said. But a question or simple greeting might have worked better than assuming the worst. Her face flushed slightly. "You're right," she admitted. "We should have done that." Another neighbor forced a weak smile. "Well, now we know," he said. "And, welcome to the block." The way he said it sounded awkward, like he was trying to make up for everything in one sentence. But he didn't mind. He wasn't looking for perfect apologies. He only wanted fairness. And he knew that understanding often came slowly. More neighbors began approaching, one by one, trying to sound polite, trying to smooth over their earlier reactions. He listened without interrupting, keeping his expression calm, not smug or proud. He didn't want them to feel afraid or ashamed, only aware. A young man holding a broom stepped forward. "Look," he said, "it wasn't personal. We just thought you were up to something." He nodded. "I know. But next time, maybe ask before assuming." The young man lowered his head. "Yeah, you're right." Slowly, little by little, the tension in the air began to fade. The neighbors relaxed their shoulders. Some even managed small smiles. People shuffled awkwardly but stayed near him, wanting to show they weren't hostile anymore. But even as the atmosphere softened, there was still something unspoken hanging between them. Something. None of them were ready to confront Jest, yet they had judged him on sight alone. They had assumed he didn't belong, and now they had learned he owned the very land they lived on. He knew this moment would linger in their minds much longer than the sirens or the documents. It would make them think. It would make them reconsider how quickly they reacted to people they didn't recognize. His assistant looked at him gently, as if asking a silent question. "Are you okay?" He gave a small nod. He was fine. He had expected things like this before. But even he was surprised by how fast everything had happened. He took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air clear his thoughts. The block felt different now. The same houses, the same trees, the same windows, but the silence was heavier. Filled with a mix of regret and curiosity from the neighbors, the street felt different after the police cars left. Even though nothing physical had changed, the houses still stood in their usual lines. The fences were still slightly crooked in some yards, and the morning sun still rested gently on the quiet pavement. But the people had changed their expressions, their attitudes, their posture. They looked at him not with suspicion now, but with a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. Like they were trying to figure out how to repair something they had broken without meaning to. He didn't rush into any conversation. He didn't try to make anyone feel guilty or uncomfortable. He simply stood quietly, observing the neighborhood with the same calm attitude he had when he first arrived. His assistant waited near him, holding the folder against her chest, sensing that the next few minutes mattered. Not because he needed validation, because the neighbors needed a chance to adjust to the truth. A man who had been silent this whole time stepped closer. He was holding a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from awkwardness. "Listen," the man said, clearing his throat. We didn't know you were the owner. We thought maybe you were looking for trouble." He looked at the man calmly. "I understand," he said softly. "But what made you think that?" The man hesitated. He looked around as if searching for the right words. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess we're just used to seeing the same people here every day. When someone new walks around taking pictures, it feels strange." He paused before answering. "Feelings aren't facts," he said gently, "but they can lead to misunderstandings." The man lowered his eyes and nodded slowly, as if he had never thought about it that way before. A woman stepped forward next. She had a small dog on a leash, and the dog was sniffing the ground like nothing unusual had happened. The woman, however, looked troubled. "I called my sister during the whole thing," she said, sounding embarrassed. "I told her someone suspicious was walking around. Now I feel really foolish. I didn't want to make her feel worse." "It happens," he said. "But next time, maybe try talking to the person first. You might be surprised by the answer." She nodded quickly. "You're right. I should have been more open." More neighbors walked over, slowly gathering near him, like students approaching a teacher after realizing they misunderstood the lesson. Each one had the same hesitant, apologetic expression. Some lifted their hands halfway, as if unsure whether to wave or keep them down. Others tried to start small talk just to fill the silence. His assistant glanced at him with a soft smile. She whispered, "They're trying." He nodded. Yes, they were. Before long, there was a small circle of residents around him. This wasn't the scene anyone expected when the day began. People stood with folded arms, then slowly relaxed them. A few looked at each other as if realizing they had acted out of habit rather than reason. Finally, the tall man who had been the loudest earlier cleared his throat. "Can I ask something?" he said. "Of course," he replied. "How long have you owned the block?" the man asked, rubbing his hand across his chin. "A little over a year," he answered. "But the paperwork and plans took time. That's why I didn't come here earlier." The man blinked. "A year? And we didn't know?" "There was no reason for you to know," he said. "Most owners don't walk around themselves. They send others. But I like to see things with my own eyes." The neighbors exchanged glances. Many of them had never met a property owner face to face. They were used to dealing with managers, landlords, or people who never showed up in person. A young woman with a scarf wrapped around her hair stepped forward. "So why are you checking everything?" she asked. He took a moment before answering. "Because I want to understand what needs fixing," he said. "This block has potential. It just needs care." The woman seemed surprised. "You want to fix things? Like, improve the place?" He nodded. "Yes, but I don't want to make changes without understanding the people who live here. I want the improvements to help not cause stress." Some neighbors softened instantly. The idea of someone genuinely caring about the condition of their homes, rather than just collecting rent or ignoring problems, was new to them. A middle-aged man, who had been quiet until now, raised his hand slightly. "Does this mean rent will go up?" he asked in a careful voice. He shook his head. "Not right now. I want the repairs done first, and when changes happen, I prefer to talk with residents before making decisions." That answer eased the tension more than anything else so far. People exhaled quietly, relieved. A few even smiled. The neighbor with the dog spoke again. "You seem different from the previous owners," she said gently. "I don't know about that," he replied. "I just believe if people live on my land, then I should know what they need." The group nodded slowly. They weren't used to that kind of thinking. It wasn't dramatic or fancy, it was simple and human. He took another slow look around the street. The cracked sidewalks, the uneven fences, the roofs that needed patching, faded painted, all made him feel more determined. He wanted this block to be better, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he believed people deserved to live in a place they felt proud of. Another neighbor, an older woman with soft eyes, stepped closer. "We didn't treat you right today," she said. "You were calm the whole time, but we weren't. I'm sorry for that." He gave her a warm nod. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." The older woman took a breath, then asked, "What are your plans? I mean, what do you want to do with the block?" He thought for a moment. "I want to repair what's broken," he said. "Clean up the alley. Fix the roofs. Repaint the buildings. Make the place feel safer at night. Make the yards nicer. And most importantly, listen to what you all want." The neighbors stood quietly, soaking in his words. This wasn't something they heard often. They were used to being ignored, rushed, or treated as if their opinions didn't matter. A teenager who had been standing near his bike finally spoke up. "Do you want help?" he asked. "I mean, with cleaning or something?" His assistant smiled at the teen. "That's kind of you," she said. "We might need volunteers later." The teen grinned. "I like fixing things. My dad has tools." He smiled back. "I'll remember that." Soon others began offering help too. A woman said she could assist with repainting. A man said he knew someone who repaired fences at a low cost. Someone else offered to trim overgrown bushes. Several people nodded eagerly, saying the block needed teamwork. For the first time that day, he felt the street coming alive, not with suspicion, but with connection. It felt almost like a neighborhood meeting, one that should have happened long ago. People weren't whispering anymore. They spoke openly, kindly, with a tone that carried hope. But the biggest shift came when the tall man, the one who had been the loudest earlier, walked up slowly, almost reluctantly. "Look," he said, "I feel like I owe you an apology. I didn't even give you a chance to speak earlier. I just saw you as a stranger." "Apology accepted," he said calmly. "But I hope you'll see me differently now." The tall man nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, I will." As the group started to break apart, people didn't disappear into their homes right away. They lingered, like the block itself didn't want the moment to end too quickly. People chatted among themselves, gradually shifting the atmosphere from tense to friendly. His assistant whispered, "They're warming up." He gave a small smile. "They're human," he said softly. "Most people just need a moment to adjust." As the neighbors slowly drifted away, he decided to continue his walk down the block, this time with his assistant beside him. But something unexpected happened. Some residents followed too, curious, wanting to understand his plans better. One neighbor pointed at a broken step. "That thing's been like that for 2 years," she said. "No one ever fixed it." "We'll fix it soon," he assured her. Another pointed at a gutter overflowing with old leaves. "That one floods every time it rains," he was told. "We'll clear it." The child tugged at his sleeve, pointing at a fence. "My ball always gets stuck in there." "We'll replace that fence," he promised, with a gentle smile. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was simple. Real conversation, people sharing their worries, their wishes, their frustrations. And him listening carefully, taking notes with the same notebook he had used earlier. But now, the neighbors didn't look at the notebook suspiciously. They looked at it with hope. He noticed how different their voices sounded. Softer, warmer, more trusting. And that trust mattered more to him than the papers in the folder or the title of owner. He didn't want to be feared or admired. He simply wanted fairness, respect, and connection. As they reached the end of the block, he looked back and saw something that made him stop for a moment. People were still outside, not watching him with suspicion, but talking with each other, smiling, engaging. It was as if the block had woken up from a long sleep. His assistant touched his arm gently. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "I think this place can become something special," he said. "But it won't happen alone." She nodded. "They'll help," she whispered. "You saw how they responded." He smiled. "Yes, they just needed to understand." He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this quiet shift was only the beginning. The block had more stories hidden behind its fences and walls. And now that the neighbors knew who he was, they were ready to tell him everything they had been holding inside, and he was ready to listen. The moment the police cars finally drove away, the whole street felt strangely quiet. A few minutes earlier, everyone had been loud and confident, pointing fingers, shouting things, insisting they knew everything. Now they stood there like kids caught doing something wrong. Some looked at the ground, some pretended to check their phone, and a few just walked back to their homes without saying anything at all. But most of them didn't leave. They hovered around awkwardly, trying to decide what to do next, as if the truth was too heavy for them to carry. He didn't rush, just stood there, letting the moment settle, letting the reality sink into them. He had no reason to rub anything in. The reactions were doing that all on their own. Finally, one of the men who had been the loudest earlier stepped forward. Just an hour ago, he had accused him of lying in front of the police, pointed at him aggressively, and demanded he be removed from the neighborhood. Now his voice was soft, almost shaky. "Hey, listen," the man said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We didn't know who you were. You know how things are lately. Everyone's on edge." The narrator nodded slowly, not saying anything. He wanted to see where this would go. Another neighbor, a woman who had been shouting earlier, stepped in quickly. "Yeah," she said, trying to sound warm. "I think we all just misunderstood. We thought something was wrong. We were only trying to protect the street." He still didn't respond. Not because he wanted to intimidate them, but because he genuinely didn't know what to say yet. Their apologies felt rushed, almost rehearsed. Like they were trying to fix their image now that they knew he wasn't just some stranger with a camera. A third person chimed in. "Honestly, we didn't even call the police for anything serious," he claimed. "We were just checking in, making sure everything was okay." that made him lift his eyes a little. He remembered how that same man had shouted earlier, telling the officers to take him away before he causes trouble. But he didn't correct him. He didn't bring up the way they had talked to him. Not now. He just listened. People were suddenly eager to show they were friendly. They offered awkward small talk, asked if he needed water, offered to show him where some of the alleys led, things they never would have done an hour before. It was strange seeing their attitudes flip so quickly. It's almost like watching someone change masks in a play. He finally spoke, keeping his voice calm. "It's all right, I understand." That simple line seemed to relax them. Some nodded quickly, relieved that he wasn't angry or planning to accuse them of anything. The street slowly grew louder again, but this time in a gentle, polite way. People murmured, whispered to each other, and tried to figure out how to behave around him now. A small group stayed near him, acting overly helpful. One offered to hold his folder. Another asked if he needed directions. Someone else even said, "If you're planning to make any changes, let us know. We'd love to help." He smiled politely but kept his distance. It wasn't cold, but he wasn't going to pretend everything was suddenly normal either. When the crowd finally broke apart, he started walking again, going from building to building and taking slow notes. The street was different now. Nobody complained. Nobody called out rude comments. Nobody questioned why he was there. In fact, they kept a respectful distance, watching but staying quiet. As he walked, he noticed how some of them peeked from behind curtains. Others stepped outside and gave quick waves, trying to seem friendly. Few even tried to strike up conversations about weather or upcoming holidays, anything that could lighten the mood. It was like the entire block collectively decided to rewrite the earlier scene, hoping he would forget it completely. He couldn't blame them for trying. People react strangely when their assumptions fall apart. He also couldn't help thinking about how easy it is for people to judge someone based on appearances, without asking questions or giving the benefit of the doubt. He continued inspecting the buildings, taking a closer look at cracked walls, old stairs, faded signs, and broken fences. These were the reasons he had come in the first place. The block needed improvements, it needed care, and he had plans to bring life back into it. After some time, he sat down on a bench at the end of the street. The same bench where he had waited earlier while the neighbors argued with the police. The difference now was that the people walking by slowed down, smiled politely, and then kept going quickly, as if they didn't want to disturb him. A neighbor approached him again, carrying a plastic bag. "Here," he said, offering a few cold drinks. "We figured you might be tired." The narrator thanked him and accepted one, even though he knew the gesture came more from guilt than kindness. A woman approached next. She wasn't rude earlier, but she didn't defend him either when others made accusations. Oh, she seemed nervous. "I hope you didn't take anything personally," she said. "You know how people get carried away." He nodded again. "I understand," he repeated. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was true. Really did understand. People fear what they don't recognize. They create stories in their minds faster than they create understanding. The sky slowly shifted into a softer shade of orange as the day began to wind down. A few children played on the sidewalk near a house, and their parents kept glancing over at him, probably worried their kids might bother him. It was almost amusing in a gentle way. He talked to a couple of people as the evening went on, just simple conversations. A man asked if he had plans for the area. A woman asked if the buildings would be torn down. Someone else warned him about a stray cat that always jumped out of trash bins near the corner. These conversations were normal, human, and a bit clumsy, every now and then. Someone mentioned the earlier incident, always with the same mix of embarrassment and excuses. One person said, "We just reacted too fast." Another said, "We thought you might have been lost." Someone else said, "We didn't mean to make a big deal." He didn't correct them. He didn't remind them of their harsh words. He didn't repeat what the police told them, simply allowed them to speak and then moved on. Holding on to anger never helps. And besides, he had a bigger goal. The block needed improvement, and no argument or misunderstanding was going to stop his plans. As he stood near the third building on the corner, one man approached with a friendly smile. "So what's the plan?" the man asked. "Big changes coming?" The narrator shrugged lightly. "Just improvements. No one will lose their home, nothing extreme." The man's relief was so obvious that it was almost touching. "Good," he said with a nervous laugh. We were worried for a moment there. It was clear the rumors had already started, and they would continue spreading through the night. People were going to talk at their dinner tables, send messages, call relatives, and say, "You won't believe what happened today. That was fine." People need stories to help them process things. Before leaving, he walked the full block one last time. Same sidewalk he had walked earlier, when people had stared at him like he didn't belong. Now those same people greeted him with small smiles and soft voices. They didn't know how to act around him, but they were trying, and that was enough for now. He passed by the house of the man who had yelled at him the most. Surprisingly, the man stepped outside again. He looked uncomfortable, rubbing his hands together. "Listen," he said, "I really am sorry for earlier. We made wrong assumptions." "It's all right," the narrator replied gently. "I'm not upset." The man nodded slowly, visibly relieved. "If you need anything at all, just knock. We're neighbors now." The narrator smiled politely, then continued walking. When he finally reached his car, he leaned against it for a moment and looked back at the street. The same block, the same houses, the same people. But everything felt different now. People had seen a side of themselves they probably weren't proud of. He had seen how quickly trust could break and how quickly people could change when the truth came out. He didn't feel angry. He felt thoughtful. The world was full of moments like this, moments where people revealed who they really were, or who they feared they might be. He took a deep breath and got into his car. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new reactions, and new decisions. He wasn't looking for revenge, and he wasn't going to use his ownership as a weapon. He wanted the block to grow, to improve, and to become a place where people felt safe not just from outsiders, but from their own assumptions. As he drove away, the streetlights flickered on one by one. Kids ran inside as parents called them home. Doors closed gently. Curtains were pulled. And the block settled into its normal nightly rhythm, peaceful and calm. Only this time, the people who lived there knew something they hadn't known before. The quiet man with the camera, the one they had feared and judged, was the person who held the future of their block in his hands, and it was clear none of them would ever look at him more at their own behavior. The same way again, the next few weeks moved quietly, almost like the block was trying to recover from the tension of that strange day. The weather changed a little, mornings grew a bit cooler, and people started spending more time indoors. But whenever he walked down the street, the reaction was still the same quick smiles, soft greetings, and a certain kind of careful respect that hadn't existed before. He didn't rush into anything. He took his time meeting with his development team, looking through old building records, talking to inspectors, and walking the block again and again until he understood every corner of it. Some buildings needed repairs, some needed a deep cleaning, and a few needed major updates. But none of it was impossible. He just needed patience. Every time he visited, the neighbors watched him. They didn't stare like before, but they paid attention. Some came out to chat, trying to act friendly. Others peeked through curtains or stood on their porches pretending to sweep or water plants. Nobody wanted to be caught being rude again. One afternoon, while he was checking the side of an old building with a measuring tape, a man approached him with a nervous laugh. "So, any big changes coming?" The man asked carefully, like he was afraid of the answer. He shook his head. "Nothing too big, just improvements. Things that will make the block nicer for everyone." The man let out a breath he clearly didn't know he was holding. "Good," he said. "People have been talking. You know how rumors spread around here? Every block has a rumor chain, and this one worked faster than most. Over the past few weeks, he'd overheard snippets while walking by open windows. I heard he's going to tear everything down. No, someone told me he's building shops. That can't be right. Didn't he say he's keeping the houses? He doesn't seem like the type to ruin a neighborhood. Well, he didn't seem like someone who owned the block either." Every version of the story changed little pieces, like a giant game of telephone. But he didn't correct anyone. He knew that when the time came, the truth would settle in. He wasn't planning anything extreme. He just wanted the area to feel safe, clean, and comfortable. That alone required enough work. One day, sat on the same bench where he had waited for his assistant weeks earlier. The bench where the neighbors had judged him without knowing who he was. As he sat there, he watched people walk by. They smiled, waved awkwardly, or nodded politely before hurrying away. It wasn't fear. It was more like they were trying to show respect. A woman came up to him with a homemade container of food. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, "for being patient with us that day." He accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "Maybe not," she replied softly, "but we should have handled things better. We all know that." Moments like that made the whole situation feel more human. At the end of the day, nobody was perfect. Everyone had fears and assumptions. Everyone acted on emotions sometimes. Later that week, he held a small meeting on the block. Nothing formal, just a casual walkthrough with a few neighbors. He explained the improvements he had planned: fixing cracked sidewalks, improving lighting, repainting some of the buildings, clearing old trash behind the alley, and repairing fences that had been broken for years. When he finished explaining, the group looked relieved. Some even smiled genuinely, the kind of smile that comes when a weight lifts off your shoulders. "This will really help the neighborhood," one man said quietly. "We've been hoping for changes like this for a long time," another person added. "We didn't know who to ask or who to trust. Everything always felt too complicated." He nodded gently. "I want the place to look good. Not just because I own it, but because people live here. People raise their kids here. People come home tired from work and want to feel safe." A few heads nodded quickly. The neighbors seemed to appreciate how he spoke not like a landlord, not like a boss, but like someone who understood what life on the block was actually like. In the following days, something surprising happened. People started opening up to him. They told him small stories who had lived here for years, which walls had been painted by kids in the past, where the best sunlight hit during winter afternoons, and which roofs leaked when it rained. Their memories helped him understand the emotional value of the place. One older man told him about the block. 20 years ago, how neighbors used to sit outside every evening, drinking tea and talking. He pointed to the spot where street games were played, and to the corner where families held small gatherings in the summer. The block wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a collection of moments, habits, and old stories. The narrator listened to every detail. He wanted the improvements to respect the past, not erase it. But he also knew some people were pretending to be friendly only because they feared losing their homes. He could feel it in the way they talked to Sweet, too nervous, too eager to stay on his good side. He didn't judge them for it. Uncertainty makes people cling to whatever security they can find. One afternoon, while he was inspecting a building wall, a man approached him hesitantly. "I just want to say," the man began, "I wasn't proud of how I acted that day. I guess we all judged too quickly." The narrator turned to him. "It's okay. It's in the past." The man nodded slowly. "I know, but I still think about it sometimes. Makes you realize how fast people assume things." That comment stayed with him. It was honest, simple, and true. Over time, the block grew more comfortable around him. People stopped whispering about who he was. They stopped staring from windows. Kids played on the sidewalks again, and parents didn't rush them inside when he walked by. It felt like the street had gone back to normal lonely, with a little more awareness, a little more humility. When the first repair project began, several neighbors came out to watch. Workers arrived early in the morning, breaking up old concrete and laying down new pathways. The neighbors stood together, talking softly, smiling, sometimes excited, sometimes curious. A few asked if they could help carry things or clean up small debris. He didn't need their help, but he appreciated the offer. It showed that they wanted to be part of the change. As days passed, new paint brightened the buildings. Cracks disappeared. Fences stood stronger. Old, unused trash cans were replaced. The block slowly transformed, but not in a flashy way, just clean. Simple improvements that made life easier. What surprised him most was how people changed along with the neighborhood. When the surroundings felt cared for, people behaved more calmly. They greeted each other more. They smiled more. The energy of the block softened, and the tension from that first day faded like a memory from years ago. One evening, you walked down the block again after most of the repairs were done. The sun was setting, and a warm glow stretched across the street. Kids rode their bicycles. A couple sat on their porch sharing snacks. Someone watered plants near the gate. Everything looked peaceful. One man waved to him warmly and called out, "The place looks great." "Thank you for this," another added. "It feels like a new beginning." He smiled gently. "It's everyone's block," he said. "It should feel like home." As he walked, he passed by the house of the man who had once shouted at him the loudest. That man stepped outside again, but this time he didn't look embarrassed or nervous. Instead, he looked thoughtful. "Mind if I walk with you?" the man asked. The narrator nodded, and the two walked together slowly. The man took a deep breath. "You know, when everything happened that day, I felt like I had to act tough, like I had to prove something." He paused. "But I've been thinking about it a lot. Maybe I wasn't trying to protect the street. Maybe I was just reacting without thinking." The narrator said nothing, letting the man speak. "I guess sometimes people forget what respect really looks like," the man continued. "We judge too fast. And we forget that anyone we meet could be dealing with something we don't know about. You taught us that without even trying to." The narrator finally spoke softly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." The man nodded slowly. "You're right, and I'm glad you didn't hold a grudge. Things could have gone badly," he smiled. "They didn't, because there was no reason for things to go badly." The man smiled back, a real smile, not the nervous ones from before. As they reached the end of the block, the man said, "Thanks for giving us another chance," he replied. "Thank you for growing from it."